The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation, a sea of black gowns and beaming faces. From her seat in the third row of graduates, Eleanor could just make out her husband, James, sitting between an empty chair and his mother, Helen. James caught her eye and gave her a wide, proud smile, his thumbs pointing up. Eleanor's heart swelled, but the feeling was quickly pricked by the sight of Helen, whose expression was as rigid and unyielding as the oak pews. For 4 years, Eleanor had dreamed of this day. 4 years of juggling part-time jobs, studying until her eyes burned, and sacrificing weekends with James. It was a degree in engineering, a field Helen had once openly scoffed at, calling it unladylike. Every late night, every failed experiment, every moment of doubt, it was all supposed to culminate in this single, triumphant moment. Yet, sitting there, waiting for her name to be called, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to under Helen's scrutinizing gaze. During the procession, as the graduates filed past their families, Eleanor had overheard Helen's sharp whisper to James, a poison dart aimed with perfect precision. "Look at her, trying to look so proud of herself," she'd said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She doesn't deserve this degree. All those nights away from you, for what? A piece of paper." Eleanor had pretended not to hear. Her chin held high, but the words had clung to her like tar. James had said something in a low, placating tone, but he hadn't challenged her. He rarely did. He was a man caught between two loyalties, and Eleanor understood that. But it didn't make the sting of his mother's cruelty any less painful. Helen believed Eleanor had stolen her son, luring him away from the life she had envisioned for him. A life with a different kind of woman, one who would prioritize home and family above personal ambition. To Helen, Eleanor's degree wasn't an achievement. It was an act of defiance. Now, as the Dean of Engineering, a stern-faced woman named Dr. Alastair, approached the podium, the chatter in the hall subsided. "Good afternoon, graduates, faculty, and esteemed guests," she began, her voice resonating through the auditorium. "It is my profound honor to welcome you to the commencement ceremony for the Faculty of Engineering. Each of our graduates has demonstrated remarkable resilience and intellectual curiosity. But today, before we confer the degrees, we have a special tradition." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She knew about the tradition, the Dean's Medal, an award given to a student for outstanding academic achievement and contributions to the university community. It was the highest honor a graduate could receive. Whispers rippled through the rows of students. Everyone knew the frontrunner was a student named Marcus Thorne, a genius who had published 2 papers as an undergraduate. Eleanor admired him immensely. "This medal, Dr. Alistair continued, holding up a gleaming gold medallion, "is not merely for the highest grades. It is for the student who embodies the spirit of innovation, the courage to challenge convention, and the tenacity to overcome adversity." This year, the selection was exceptionally difficult, but one name consistently rose to the top. Eleanor held her breath, her gaze flitting back to James. He was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the stage. Even Helen looked momentarily intrigued. "This student," Dr. Alastair announced, her voice rising with gravitas, "joined our program with a conditional acceptance, worked 2 jobs to fund her studies, and spearheaded a project that has already secured provisional patents and garnered interest from industry leaders. She has redefined what is possible." There was a pause, a collective intake of breath across the hall. Eleanor's heart was hammering against her ribs. It couldn't be. "So, for the first time in the history of this university," the dean declared, her eyes scanning the sea of graduates and locking directly onto Eleanor's, "it is my distinct pleasure to call upon the recipient of the Dean's Medal first, before all others. Would Eleanor Vance please come to the stage?" For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor's name echoed in the vast hall, but it felt disconnected from her, as if the dean were speaking of someone else. A gentle nudge from the graduate sitting beside her, a classmate named Sarah, broke the spell. "Eleanor, that's you," she whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. "Go!" The sounds of the auditorium rushed back in, a wave of applause starting, punctuated by surprised gasps. Slowly, as if moving through water, Eleanor rose to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, and her hands trembled. Her gaze found James again. He was on his feet, clapping so hard his hands were a blur, his face a perfect picture of unrestrained joy and pride. And next to him, Helen. She was still seated, her posture ramrod straight, her face a mask of disbelief. Her mouth was slightly agape, and for the first time since Eleanor had known her, Helen looked utterly speechless. The disdain had been replaced by a blank, stunned confusion. It was as if her entire worldview had been shattered in a single sentence. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey of Eleanor's life. With each step, the whispers of Helen's cruelty echoed in her mind. She doesn't deserve this. All those nights away from you, for what? But another voice now rose to meet them. The powerful, clear voice of Dean Allister. As Eleanor ascended the short flight of stairs to the stage, the dean continued to speak, her words painting a picture of Eleanor's journey that Helen had always refused to see. Eleanor's final year project, Dr. Allister explained, her tone warm with admiration, was not just a theoretical exercise. She developed a low-cost water filtration system using locally sourced materials, a design with the potential to bring clean drinking water to remote communities. While others were refining existing theories, Ms. Vance was in the lab, often alone and late into the night, building something that could change lives. Eleanor stood before the dean, her heart pounding a rhythm of vindication. These were the nights Helen had condemned as selfish, the time she claimed Eleanor was stealing from James. The truth was, Eleanor had been pouring her soul into work that mattered, work that was now being celebrated on the biggest stage of her life. Dr. Allister placed the heavy, cool medallion around Eleanor's neck. The weight of it was grounding, a tangible symbol of her struggle and her success. "Your dedication, Eleanor, is an inspiration to us all," the dean said, her voice softer now, meant only for her. "We are immensely proud to call you an alumna of this university." She then shook Eleanor's hand firmly, a gesture of profound respect. As Eleanor turned to face the audience, the applause swelled into a standing ovation. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar of approval. Her fellow graduates were on their feet, many of them cheering her name. They were the ones who had seen her in the library at dawn, who had worked alongside her in the workshops, who knew the depth of her commitment. Their recognition felt just as significant as the medal itself. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see everything. She saw James, his face wet with tears, beaming at her with a love so fierce it felt like a physical force. And she saw Helen. The shock on her mother-in-law's face had now curdled into something else, something harder to read. It was a complex mixture of anger, humiliation, and perhaps, for the very first time, a flicker of grudging respect. The woman who had tried to diminish her, to reduce her ambition to a flaw, was now forced to witness her triumph. Helen did not stand. She remained seated, a solitary, rigid figure amidst a sea of celebration, looking smaller than Eleanor had ever seen her. The dean gestured for Eleanor to step to the podium. It wasn't standard procedure, but this entire moment was anything but standard. The crowd quieted, waiting. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces looking up at her, finally resting once more on her mother-in-law. She had a choice. She could use this moment to expose the years of quiet cruelty, or she could take another path. Eleanor gripped the sides of the wooden podium, its sturdiness a small comfort to her trembling hands. The silence of the hall was a heavy blanket. This was her stage, a platform she had earned through sheer force of will. She could say anything. She could unleash the years of frustration, the hurt that had been so carefully stored away. She could shame Helen in front of her son and hundreds of strangers. She met James's tear-filled eyes, and in their depths she saw not only pride but a silent plea. A plea for grace. He knew his mother's cruelty, and he knew the power Eleanor held in this moment. Looking at him, Eleanor realized that vengeance would only serve to deepen the rift in their family, leaving James permanently fractured in the middle. Her victory was the medal around her neck and the degree she was about to receive. It wasn't in proving Helen wrong. It was in proving herself right. Clearing her throat, she began to speak, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with every word. I honestly don't know what to say. I certainly wasn't expecting this, she started, a small, genuine laugh escaping her lips, which eased the tension in the hall. First, I have to thank Dean Allister and the entire faculty. You challenged us, you pushed us, and you gave us the tools not just to find answers but to ask the right questions. Thank you. She paused, turning her head to look at the rows of her fellow graduates. To my classmates, my friends, we did it. The late nights in the lab, the impossible deadlines, the moments we thought we couldn't go on, they weren't so lonely because we had each other. Your brilliance and your friendship inspired me every single day. Then, her eyes found their way back to her family. To my husband, James, she said, her voice softening with emotion. You are the heart of my story. You made me coffee at 3 a.m. You listened to me ramble about polymer chains and stress coefficients. And you never once doubted me, even when I doubted myself. You sacrificed so much for this dream to be possible. This medal is as much yours as it is mine. James's face crumpled, and he wiped at his eyes, unashamed. And then, Eleanor did the last thing anyone expected. Her gaze shifted to her mother-in-law. "I also want to thank those who taught me the toughest lessons," she said, her tone measured and calm, devoid of any malice. "I learned that passion isn't always understood. I learned that ambition can be seen as a threat. And most importantly, I learned that the drive to prove yourself can be a powerful fuel. It forces you to rely on your own strength and to find a validation that comes not from the approval of others, but from the quiet, unshakable belief in your own worth. So thank you for teaching me resilience." To the vast majority of the audience, it was an inspiring, if slightly cryptic, message about overcoming adversity. But to Helen, every word was a perfectly aimed, gracefully delivered arrow. It was not an attack, but a declaration of unassailable strength. Eleanor was not just an engineer, she was a woman who could not be broken. Helen's face, which had been a mask of shock, hardened into something like stone. There was no apology in her eyes, no dawning realization. There was only the cold, hard fury of defeat. She had been outmaneuvered, not with anger, but with poise. Eleanor had refused to sink to her level, and in doing so, had risen even higher. With a final, "Thank you," Eleanor stepped back from the podium to another round of thunderous applause. She walked back to her seat, the weight of the medal a comforting presence on her chest. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. One by one, the other graduates were called, their names a river of accomplishment flowing through the hall. When Eleanor Vance was called again, this time for her degree, the applause was louder and longer than for anyone else. As she held the diploma in her hand, the embossed paper felt sacred. It wasn't just a degree, it was a testament. It was the story of her journey, and no one, not even Helen, could ever take that away from her. When the ceremony finally concluded, the air filled with the sounds of celebration, of caps thrown in the air and joyful shouts. It was over, and a new, more uncertain moment was about to begin. The family reunion. The moment the formal proceedings ended, a joyous chaos erupted. Graduates hugged each other, laughing and crying, while families surged forward, their arms laden with bouquets and their faces beaming. Eleanor was immediately swarmed by her classmates, all wanting to get a closer look at the dean's medal and offer their heartfelt congratulations. "I can't believe you kept that project so quiet," Sarah exclaimed, giving her a tight hug. "You deserve every bit of this, Eleanor." Amid the sea of happy faces, Eleanor searched for the one that mattered most. She finally saw him, making his way through the crowd with a determined look on his face. James reached her and without a word wrapped her in an embrace so tight it lifted her off her feet. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she could feel his body shaking with emotion. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice thick. "Absolutely incredible. I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." When he pulled back, his eyes were red-rimmed but shining. He gently touched the medal hanging around her neck. "See? I told you. I told you all that hard work would pay off." For a few precious moments, it was just the two of them, an island of shared victory in the bustling crowd. They were a team. His unwavering support had been the foundation upon which she had built her dreams. "We did it," she corrected him softly, placing her hand over his. The moment was broken by a cool, clipped voice. "Well, James, aren't you going to introduce me to the star of the show?" They both turned. Helen was standing there, her purse clutched in front of her like a shield. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were cold. The empty chair from the ceremony was a silent, looming presence between them. She had clearly waited for a moment to approach alone. The crowd seemed to part around her, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. James, ever the peacemaker, immediately stepped into the breach. "Of course, Mum. Here she is, the guest of honor." He put his arm around Eleanor's waist, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by his mother. "Eleanor, Mum was just saying how surprised she was." "Surprised is one word for it," Helen said, her gaze flicking from Eleanor's face to the gold medal and back again. She didn't congratulate her. She didn't acknowledge the speech. She simply observed, as if inspecting a curious and unexpected specimen. "Quite a performance you gave up there. You have a flair for the dramatic, it seems." The barb was unmistakable. Helen was framing Eleanor's triumph not as an achievement, but as a calculated theatrical display. It was a pathetic attempt to regain control, to diminish the moment by questioning its authenticity. Before Eleanor could respond, James stiffened. It was a subtle shift, but Eleanor felt it. The years of placating, of absorbing his mother's passive aggression to keep the peace, had reached a breaking point. "It wasn't a performance, Mum," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was a recognition of 4 years of her life, of her brilliance. Helen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of shock appearing on her face. Her son was directly contradicting her, defending his wife without hesitation. It was a shift in the family dynamic that was years in the making. Brilliance? She scoffed, recovering quickly. She spent more time in that lab than she did in her own home. A wife should be present for her husband. This time, Eleanor spoke for herself. Her voice was calm, holding no trace of the anger that churned within her. The time I spent in that lab will help bring clean water to people who have none, Helen, she stated simply. And my husband was with me every step of the way, supporting a dream that was bigger than just the two of us. That's what a partnership looks like. She let the words hang in the air. She wasn't just defending her choices. She was defining her marriage, drawing a clear line in the sand. This was their life, their partnership, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions, something Helen, with her outdated and rigid expectations, could never understand. Helen stared at her, the mask of civility finally cracking. A sneer twisted her lips. So you've saved the world, have you? And what happens now? You'll be too busy for your family, I suppose. Too important for the little things. This degree, this medal, they will just pull you further away from where you belong. No, Eleanor replied, her voice filled with a newfound certainty that resonated deeper than any academic honor. It has brought me exactly where I belong. Her eyes met James's, and in his gaze, she found her home, her anchor, her truth. Helen looked from her son to her daughter-in-law, a silent battle of wills playing out in the space between them. For the first time, she was not facing Eleanor alone. She was facing a united front, and she had lost. Helen's sneer faltered, the last of her ammunition spent. She looked at James, her eyes searching for the son who always smoothed things over, the boy who would choose peace over principle. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who stood, resolute, by his wife's side. His silence was a fortress she could not breach. Defeated, Helen finally broke eye contact. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of concession so foreign to her it looked painful. I see, she said, the words barely audible above the celebratory noise. Without another glance, she turned and walked away, a solitary figure retreating from a battlefield of her own making, swallowed by a crowd celebrating a victory she could neither comprehend nor control. As Eleanor watched her go, she felt not a surge of vindictive triumph, but a quiet, profound sense of release. The heavy cloak of seeking Helen's approval, a garment she hadn't even realized she was wearing, simply fell away. Her worth wasn't a reflection in her mother-in-law's critical eyes. It was the solid weight of the medal on her chest, the diploma in her hand, and the unwavering love of the man beside her. Are you okay? James asked softly, turning her to face him, his hands framing her face as if to reassure himself she was real. Eleanor looked up at him, a genuine, unburdened smile spreading across her face, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes. I'm better than okay, she said, her voice clear and strong. I'm free. That evening, long after the graduation gown had been carefully put away, they sat in their small apartment. The dean's medal lay on the coffee table, its gold finish catching the soft lamplight like a tiny sun. The air was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind that follows a storm. I should have said something sooner, James said, breaking the quiet. He stared at the medal, not at her. All those years, every dinner, every comment she made, I would just change the subject. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but it wasn't peace. It was just quiet, and you were paying the price for it. I am so sorry, Elle. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Hey, look at me. He finally met her gaze. You believed in me when I was working until 3 a.m. You celebrated my successes and you held me when I failed. You were my peace, James. Today you just made sure she knew it too. We're a team, you and me. That's all that matters. The years that followed were a testament to that truth. Eleanor's career became a powerful extension of her passion. She joined a forward-thinking humanitarian engineering firm, and her final year project became her first major assignment. She saw her designs move from paper to production, and then she saw them work in the real world. During her first field deployment in a remote mountain village, she watched as a young girl, no older than 10, took her first sip of clean water from a spigot Eleanor's team had installed. The girl's mother had tears in her eyes as she thanked Eleanor in a language she didn't speak, but with a gratitude that was universal. In that moment, every late night in the lab, every dismissive comment from Helen, felt infinitesimally small. This was the why. She and James built a life filled with a beautiful, chaotic harmony. They had 2 children, a son, Leo, with James's gentle nature, and a daughter, Maya, who had Eleanor's fierce, analytical eyes. Their home was a place of creativity, filled with Lego engineering projects, half-finished paintings, and the constant sound of laughter. Eleanor made sure Maya knew that bossy was just a word people used when a girl had a good idea. She taught her how to use a soldering iron and how to write a line of code, telling her, "Your mind is a toolbox, honey. Never let anyone tell you there are tools you aren't allowed to use." The relationship with Helen thawed, but it did not melt. It was a slow, glacial process, marked by tiny shifts over many years. The first Christmas after the graduation, Helen had been stiff and formal. A year later, she brought a gift specifically for Eleanor, a leather-bound journal. "For your ideas," she'd mumbled, avoiding eye contact. It was a small concession, but a concession nonetheless. When Maya was born, Helen held her granddaughter and looked at Eleanor over the baby's head. "She has your eyes," she'd said. It wasn't a compliment, merely a statement of fact, but it was an acknowledgement that Eleanor was now an undeniable and permanent part of the family tapestry. The true turning point came nearly a decade after the graduation. James had taken the children to visit their grandmother for the afternoon. He came home with a curious look on his face. He handed Eleanor a folded, slightly crinkled page from a national journal. It was a multi-page profile on Eleanor's firm, featuring a large photo of her on-site, talking with local workers. The article praised her team's work, detailing the impact of the water filtration project, which was now active in over a dozen countries. "She had it on her fridge," James said, his voice full of wonder, "tucked under a magnet. She didn't say a word about it, just watched me read it and then said, 'Your family will be hungry. You should get home.'" Eleanor stared at the clipping. It was Helen's white flag. It was her surrender, offered in the only way her pride would allow, not with words of apology, but with the cold, hard evidence of success. She couldn't bring herself to praise the woman who had defied her, but she could no longer deny the importance of her work. She had posted the article on her refrigerator, a silent public admission for anyone who entered her kitchen to see, "My daughter-in-law is someone of consequence." That night, after her children were asleep and the house was quiet, Eleanor took the Dean's Medal from its box. It felt heavier than she remembered. She no longer recalled the specific sting of Helen's words from that day. They had faded, losing their power. Instead, she remembered the thunderous applause from her peers, the unrestrained pride on James's face, and the unshakable feeling of standing on that stage, bathed in the light of her own hard-won triumph. She hadn't just earned a degree that day. She had claimed her voice, her power, and her future. She had learned that resilience wasn't about building walls to keep critics out, but about building a foundation so strong that no one could ever shake it. It was a lesson she carried with her always, a quiet reminder that the most important validation in the world will never come from the audience. It comes from the unwavering belief you hold within. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not about proving others wrong, but about proving to ourselves that we are strong enough to rise.